Senator Lesser, first of all, thank you for joining us today on the state we're in. We appreciate your time. I'd like to get your thoughts on a couple of issues as they relate to some of the work you've been doing in Massachusetts. One of them is student loan debt relief. President-elect Biden has been under increasing pressure to do something about student loan debt relief when he takes office. What are your expectations? What are your hopes for the president-elect when he does take office in January with regard to student loan debt? What do you hope he does?
What I would say, just zooming out for a second, collectively, there are more than $1.4 trillion in outstanding student loans in the United States right now. Here in Massachusetts, we have more than $40 billion in pending student loan debt. A recent estimate came out that was published in the Wall Street Journal that estimates that as much as $400 billion in current student loan debt is going to be lost. It's not going to be paid, which will show up as a loss on the balance sheet of the federal government. As the economy continues to struggle as we recover or begin to hopefully recover and come out of COVID-19, frankly, one of the hidden landmines for us is student debt. Often it's young people that are losing their jobs first. It's young people who are seeing their hours cut first as the coronavirus has continued to wreak havoc on so many elements of our economy. And it's the inability to pay those loans that's going to trigger a broader systemic collapse or crisis in the overall economy, much the way, Ray, the housing crisis triggered a much broader financial collapse during the 2008-2009 recession. And actually, the comparisons are alarming. Back in 2007, there was a slowdown in the economy, which led to increased job losses, a small fraction of the number of job losses compared to this recession. That triggered a range of defaults on mortgages, which snowballed into the global financial crisis. We can risk that here also, which is that you have high numbers of still unemployed, and especially high unemployed among young workers. That could lead to escalating numbers of defaults on student loans that could lead to a much broader breakdown. So not only is it the right thing to do to get help to students, to get help to their families who are struggling, and to graduates, but it's also an essential piece of our economic recovery, because this is an anvil that's pulling our entire economy down right now. So, for example, one of the things that Joe Biden said on the campaign trail is that he would try to excuse or cancel as much as $50,000 worth of debt. I'd also point out that there are significant reforms that were put in place when he was vice president by the Obama administration, including a federal student loan bill of rights that the Trump administration voided. He could put that back up on day one, and that would provide a lot of help to people to, for example, get their student loans re-examined, to enter forbearance or payment plans, especially for veterans and public service workers like teachers and police and firefighters, try to get help to them and then work out from there.
Senator Lesser, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Schumer, for example, have asked President-elect Biden, when he takes office in January, to forgive $50,000 worth of student debts through executive order immediately and not get congressional approval. Do you feel this is a legal step? Can he do that through executive order? And do you feel it's something he should pursue, or should he go through Congress?
I think it's something he should seriously consider. You know, in a perfect world, you would always prefer for these measures to go through Congress. But if Congress is not taking it up, if they're not even holding hearings or engaging on the issue, if he has the power to do it by executive order, it's absolutely something he should and probably needs to look into and entertain. A lot of legal scholars have come to the conclusion that it is possible to cancel or to forego some of this debt by executive order. I'd point out that the debt is held by the federal government, and it's held by an executive office of the federal government. It's held by the Department of Education. So it would make intuitive sense that the chief executive and their agent, the Secretary of Education, would have discretion in terms of how they manage that debt program. And certainly the COVID recession is giving them the evidence that they need. Again, this Wall Street Journal report that came out, $400 billion expected in losses by the federal government in in this year alone as a result of the recession and the defaults that are expected on student loans. I'd point out that the Trump administration, by executive order, suspended some payments and some interest on student loans during the COVID-19 state of emergency. So there is a lot of discretion given to the president and given to the executive branch to manage those loan programs. And President Trump exercised that discretion, which was actually the right thing to do in COVID-19 to excuse or excuse me, not excuse, but delay payments on interest during the COVID crisis. So we'll see. I'm sure that's going to be the subject of a lot of debate and controversy in the months ahead, but we face a crisis. And it's not just young people, by the way, Ray. You have a lot of parents. You have a lot of people who are paying their loans into their 30s, 40s, 50s. You increasingly have grandparents who are co-signers of these loans. So I think it's something that's going to absolutely be at the top of the list in the new year.
And that order you just talked about that President Trump implemented back in March, I believe it was, to give these student borrowers relief from not paying those student debt payments, expires December 31st, if I'm not mistaken. Do you expect that order to be continued at that point?
Well, so I think this raises an important question, which is why the transition is so important. It's always important, but it's especially important this year. You pointed out that the expiration is December 31st. Joe Biden will not become president until January 20th. So the question is what happens in that in between. I certainly hope that the Trump administration would at least extend it through January 20th so that the new administration could then make a decision, or extend it for 6 months, for example, to give the new administration time to get up to speed and make their own decision. I certainly hope they extend it. Frankly, COVID, the cases are even worse, significantly worse than they were back in March when that order was first implemented. And there's frankly no end in sight right now. We do have vaccines coming, it looks like, but there's major question marks about when they'll be ready, how quickly they'll be distributed, and how fast it will have kind of broad impact on the population. Certainly through the winter and into early spring, it looks like we're going to continue to see, very significant virus spread, which is going to have very significant economic consequences. The reason for that order was to give people some level of relief during a pandemic and an economic crisis. That pandemic and that economic crisis are still here, so that order should be extended.
Senator Lusher, you've been a proponent of the Student Loan Bill of Rights here in Massachusetts, which passed the Massachusetts Senate. Where does that bill stand now in terms of its passage? And can you tell us a little bit about what that bill calls for?
Yeah, so that legislation has passed the Senate twice, actually, and has also passed a joint committee jointly run by both the House and the Senate. It was given a favorable report. So this program has very broad support across the State House. I'd also point out it's not a particularly unique idea for Massachusetts. There's more than a dozen states across the country that have passed their own versions of a student loan bill of rights, including peer states of ours, Connecticut just to our south, and Maryland. Maryland has, of course, a moderate Republican governor who enthusiastically signed that measure. So we're hopeful that that will create some momentum for our efforts in Massachusetts. The idea here is really very simple. It's creating rules of good behavior for student loan servicers. For the average person, the way this works is you apply through FAFSA, through your other federal aid programs, you apply for federal student loans. You're approved for those federal student loans, but then the management of that loan is handed over to what's called a servicer. For example, Navient is an example. They're one of the highest profile, one of the most widely used in Massachusetts. The servicer is the one that notifies you of your payment deadlines, is supposed to answer questions that you might have about your payments, and is also legally obligated to keep you posted of your rights. So for example, if you're a veteran, you might be entitled to certain deferrals or certain aid programs. If you are a public sector worker, like a police officer, a firefighter, a teacher, there's a program for those types of workers. And what we found is it's basically the Wild West, Ray. These servicers do not let people know about what they're entitled to. Sometimes they don't even respond to people. We had a horrific case, for example. a woman who was originally from East Longmeadow. She had cancer. She was trying to get some level of relief or help from the student loan servicer while she was recovering from cancer and couldn't work. The servicer wouldn't even return the call. So what this student loan bill of rights would do is it would put really common sense rules in place to say that, okay, if you're going to be operating in the state of Massachusetts, if you're going to be servicing people's loans, you've got to be responsive. You got to notify them of their rights. You need to operate with good behavior, and you need to operate in a way that works with people to fulfill their obligations rather than against them.
What's your expectation, Senator Lesser, of passage of the Student Loan Bill of Rights here in Massachusetts coming up?
Well, I certainly hope it happens. This is a crisis nationally. This is also a crisis in Massachusetts. We have nearly 800,000 people in Massachusetts of all walks of life that collectively, as I mentioned, owe nearly $40 billion in student loans. The average student loan debt per person is $30,000 and going up. And I would point out that the rates are as much as double or triple in the Hispanic community and in the African American community. And all of this is overlapping, Ray, because it's also overlapping with the communities that have been the most impacted by COVID-19. We know our minority communities have been disproportionately impacted. We know younger workers, who are often the first ones to get laid off, the first ones to see hours cut, are also disproportionately impacted. These are the same communities of workers who are now facing these escalating debt burdens. So, we need this. We need this protection. This is not debt forgiveness. This is not wiping away obligations. This is about making sure that basic common sense consumer protections are in place so that people aren't harassed. There were cases, for example, of servicers calling people in the middle of the night with threatening calls, repeatedly calling on holidays, on Christmas, really just harassing people and scaring them. That is not appropriate, and that doesn't get us to where we need to be, which is a more equitable state, and a state that gets this anvil of student loan debt off people's backs so that they can move forward and they can invest in their families and their communities.
Senator Lesser, I also wanted to get your thoughts on another issue, and that is the issue of transition of power here in our country, in the United States. You've worked in the Obama administration as an aide starting back in 2009. First of all, can you tell us a little bit about the transition process, how it works, and, for example, the General Services Administration has just given the formal approval for this transition from President Trump to President-elect Biden to begin. What's involved in that transition process, and has this 3-week delay since the election, how has that hampered the country in terms of moving forward for Joe Biden when he does take office in January?
So first, just to back up for a second, I was involved in 2008 in a very intimate way. I was the assistant to David Axelrod, who was President Obama's really most senior aide and counselor. I was involved both. I worked in President-elect Obama's transition office in Chicago in the weeks after the election in 2008, and I was there at the transition office in Washington, D.C. After he moved with his family to Washington, D.C. to get ready to move into the White House. I was one of the first aides to walk into the White House on Inauguration Day after he took the oath of office. And I worked actually with staff members and counterparts in the Bush administration on the transition. And I have to say, obviously George W. Bush was a Republican, Barack Obama was a Democrat. Obama didn't run against Bush. He ran against John McCain, of course, but there were a lot of tough words and tough moments on that campaign. And a lot of the 2008 Obama campaign was about repudiating a lot of the issues and the mistakes, I would argue, of the Bush administration. But that stopped at the water's edge. We have a 2-century tradition in our country that when the election is over, you have a peaceful and cooperative transition of power. So the Bush team, I must say, was incredibly accessible. They were helpful, and they were very professional in giving us the resources and the tools and the information we needed to do our job. And I would point out this delay has real consequences. The 9/11 Commission report pointed to the delay in the Bush team getting up to speed during their transition in 2000, of course, because of the Florida recount, they said that that was part of what hampered them on 9/11 because they didn't have the personnel in place at the various national security agencies they needed as a result of those delays that went back to the 2000 transition. So this does real damage to the president's ability to be effective, which in turn does damage to the country. But it also does damage to our system, which really relies on trust and the peaceful transfer of power from one president to another. That being said, there's nobody on earth probably more prepared than Joe Biden to walk in day one. And the team he's already announced, Janet Yellen at Treasury, Anthony Blinken as the new Secretary of State, of course, our own John Kerry back as a climate ambassador, and of course, the appointment, for example, of Ron Klain as White House Chief of Staff. These are very experienced people who have been there before. They have decades of experience, so they're very well prepared. But still, you need cooperation, you need coordination. I'll just give you one small example. Phone calls with foreign leaders. The State Department historically sets those calls up, that they help with translation services, they help with monitoring the calls, they help with counterintelligence and keeping the line secure while our president or president-elect is speaking with a foreign leader. They also help with note-taking and other follow-up necessary for those calls. They couldn't do that in this period until the GSA designation came into being because there's a law, the Presidential Transition Act, that governs how the transition operates. So there were very real consequences from that delay. Hopefully now that's in the rearview mirror and things can move forward smoothly.
You know, your office sent us a couple of pictures, and one of them was you sitting in the office of David Axelrod, and in the next office with the door open was what looked like a pensive President Obama looking out the window. What was your thought at that particular point when you were there right in the White House within arm's reach of President Obama?
Yeah, so that picture, I'm in my office, which is really like a closet where I worked, and then the president-elect or President Obama at that point is in David Axelrod's office, and they're chatting. But at that moment, a famous and really wonderful photographer, Callie Schell from Time Magazine, took that picture. And President Obama is, of course, looking out the window. You know, he had quite a lot on his mind to be thinking about. I believe that was a day or two into his presidency, but you can see the bare walls and you can see the box at my feet. We were moving in. And so that's what that photo was. So I do remember going into the West Wing shortly after the inauguration, the afternoon of January 20th, and I walked into to my desk and the little kind of cubby hole where I was working from, and the phone was already ringing. So the new team is going to have quite a lot that they're going to have to do, obviously, from day one. But it's an incredible team. Many of the people on this team I worked with in the Obama administration, and they are the most professional, the most prepared team I think you've really ever seen in American politics. So there's hopefully a lot to look forward to in 2021.
And there was another picture that we saw that showed you on Inauguration Day with all
a little younger, yeah.
with all the thousands and thousands of people in the background. That must have been some experience someday for you seeing Barack Obama inaugurated in January of 2009.
Yeah, no, I mean, a moment I'll never forget. And as important and as meaningful as seeing him take the oath of office with his family around him, it was the crowd, honestly, and it was seeing the people who had come from all over the country to watch that moment and what that moment meant to them and to their families. That really is something I've never left. And frankly, you know, at times when you feel down about work or there's a tough day, I think back to that moment and the promise of that moment and what that day meant to millions and millions of people around the country. And that's always kind of motivation for me.
Senator Lesser, can you tell the folks who are watching today just what it's like working in the White House, what the atmosphere is like, the working conditions, and just the general excitement of the job day in and day out?
I was a junior person. I walked in, I was 24 years old. but I was working for a very senior person. I was the assistant to David Axelrod, and David was really and remains very close with President Obama. He was his counselor. He was really the chief political advisor. He oversaw the speechwriting operation, the communications office, but was also really one of the last people that the president would tend to speak to and get advice from on every major decision. So, it was really honestly like being in a submarine every day. You were in there. It's a very small space, which people I think don't appreciate. The West Wing is really an addition that was built, an annex to the White House, and it's a relatively small space. And there's a lot of people kind of operating in a very small space. So it's very intimate and very intense. There's a lot coming at you every single day. So every day was really an adventure. I would tend to get there at about 7 in the morning and not leave until 8, 9 o'clock at least at night. And then of course the work would continue overnight, continued obviously on weekends. But it was frankly a great joy, and I learned so much. And I learned a lot from President Obama, from watching him operate, watching how he responded to hard situations, watching how he motivated a team. And I learned a lot from my boss, David Axelrod, and how he did the similar. So, I feel blessed, frankly, that, at the start of my career, I got to learn and observe learn from people like that and observe people like that. And one of the key people who was right down the hallway from us, if I walked outside from my desk, if I turned right, I was at the Oval Office with President Obama. If I turned left, I would hit the Vice President's office and Vice President Biden. So just very exciting moment to see him now become president.
As President-elect Biden gets ready to take office in January, what do you think is going to be his biggest immediate challenge once he is president of the United States? He said that obviously COVID is a major concern of his too, but how confident are you that he'll have a grasp, his team will have a grasp of the COVID crisis and get ahead of it and get the country moving again?
Oh, I mean, the single most important issue he'll be facing, the crisis he'll be facing the day he takes the oath, the day he puts his hand on that Bible, the moment he steps away from the podium, is going to be coronavirus. Look, this is a crisis we have not faced in our country really since World War II. We have more than 1,000 people dying a day. The numbers continue to go up. The consequences of this socially, economically, health-wise are going to be with us for a very long time. So that's really going to be his number one goal. Right beside that and very close up behind that is, of course, the economic crisis that we face and the very real, racial crisis that we face as well, fighting racism, fighting systemic racism. So I think that those are really going to be the three things right off the bat that he's going to be focused on. And I frankly just hope, for the sake of our country, that he also does something very important, which is he brings the temperature down and he brings us towards a moment of hopefully beginning to turn the page on a 4 years that was, very chaotic, to put it mildly, and begins to kind of calm the country down and focus it on these very significant challenges that we need to confront together. So emphasizing unity as well as common purpose and urgency in attacking these challenges is really going to be job number one.
Well, Senator Lesser, you certainly have been around Joe Biden, know him pretty well. What is the greatest strength you feel he'll bring to the office of presidency, especially in these divisive times in our country's history? What is going to be his greatest strength in trying to move the country forward?
Well, so there are really two items that I think are really what I find most compelling. I mean, there's a lot to really like about Joe Biden. He's a wonderful person and a good person. Two things that I think stand out, right off the bat. Number one is he is incredibly experienced. He's arguably the most experienced person to ever become president. Just the depth of experience he has had over his long career and the different types of roles he's played as vice president, as a senator, as the chair of the Judiciary Committee during both the Bork and Clarence Thomas hearings, as the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the global response to 9/11. He was at Obama's side during the last economic crisis in 2009 and implemented the Recovery Act. He was vice president during the Ebola outbreak and the H1N1 outbreak, which gave him valuable experience. So, really at every level, just in terms of the machinery of government, in terms of how Washington works, in terms of how to be effective for people, he's truly has no peer in terms of that experience. The second element, and probably actually even the more important element that I think is going to make him effective is, look, Joe Biden is someone who has reached the highest highs in life, professionally. He's now president. He ran for president. He's been in high levels of public trust, but he's also somebody who's experienced real suffering. The loss of his son, the loss of his first wife and his daughter under tragic circumstances. He overcame a stutter, a disability as a child. He's someone who's done a lot with his life and has overcome a lot of adversity. And he has a lot of character as a result. And he has a lot of empathy as a result. And at a moment when so much has been lost in our country, more than 250,000 people have died, hundreds of thousands of people are sick. Having a person with that kind of empathy, with that kind of life experience, I think is going to be very important.